Welcome to Salem Witch Trials Daily, the podcast where we explored the tragic history of 1692's witchcraft panic day by day. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
This is Sarah Jack. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the true story of Elizabeth Procter, an accused witch whose harrowing experience reveals both the extreme cruelty of the witch panic and the remarkable resilience of a survivor.
If you're familiar with Arthur Miller's 1953 play, The Crucible, you might think you know Elizabeth, but the historical reality is quite different and arguably even more compelling. Let's start with her background. She was born Elizabeth Bassett in Lynn, Massachusetts.
She was the granddaughter of Anne Burt, a Lynn woman known as a community healer who had been accused of witchcraft in 1669. Because colonists believed witchcraft passed down through family lines, this generational connection cast a dark shadow of suspicion over Elizabeth long before 1692.
In 1674, Elizabeth became the third wife of John Procter, a man who was around 60 years old during the witch trials, not the young farmer who's depicted in the play. The Proctors managed a large blended family with children from John's previous marriages and 5 that they had together, and they lived on the rented Downing farm in Salem Farms.
The trouble for Elizabeth began quietly when Ann Putnam Jr. claimed to be afflicted by Elizabeth's specter starting on March 3, 1692. Then, as the spring progressed, Nathaniel Ingersoll filed witchcraft complaints against a total of 14 people, a list that included Elizabeth Procter.
Yeah, on April 4th, Nathaniel and Jonathan Walcott filed a formal complaint against Elizabeth Procter and Sarah Cloyce. They claimed that these two women had been afflicting John Indian, who worked for Nathaniel Ingersoll part of the time, Abigail Williams, who lived next to the Ingersoll's house in the parsonage, Mary Walcott, a close neighbor, Ann Putnam Jr., and Mercy Lewis.
Interestingly, the magistrates delayed issuing a warrant right away because the Governor's Council of Assistants, the highest court in Massachusetts, decided to come up from Boston to investigate personally what was going on.
The warrants were issued on April 8th, and Elizabeth was arrested and brought to the Salem Town Meeting House alongside Sarah Cloyce for their examination on April 11th, 1692. Because top colonial officials were attending, the venue was moved to the larger meeting house in Salem Town instead of the one in Salem Village.
This was an incredibly high-profile examination attended not only by local Salem magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, but also by Deputy Governor Thomas Stanforth and 4 members of the Governor's Council, Samuel Sewell, James Russell, Isaac Addington, and Samuel Appleton.
During her examination, the afflicted girls put on a horrifying display, claiming Elizabeth's specter was biting and choking them. And a man named Benjamin Gold also claimed that Elizabeth's specter had visited him in his room a few days prior on April 7th. When asked to respond to these terrifying accusations, Elizabeth famously stood her ground. She testified, "I take God in heaven to be my witness. I know nothing of it, no more than the child unborn."
During Elizabeth's tense examination, her husband, John Procter, was present in the session and spoke up to defend her. As a direct result, he was immediately arrested, making him the first male suspect of the Salem witch trials.
The evidence against Elizabeth continued to mount in the weeks that followed. The Proctor's own servant, Mary Warren, turned against her after briefly recovering from her own afflictions. She claimed that Elizabeth bodily pulled her out of bed in the middle of the night and confessed to being a witch in her physical person.
Furthermore, on April 22nd, Deliverance Hobbs claimed she attended a witch's Sabbath where she saw 9 people, specifically naming both Elizabeth and John Procter among the attendees, with spectral evidence and coerced confessions piling up. The Salem magistrates ultimately condemned both Elizabeth and John Procter to death.
John was tragically hanged on August 19th, 1692. However, Elizabeth survived because she was newly pregnant with her 6th child at the time of her examination, though she may not have even realized it yet. But by pleading her belly in August, she received a stay of execution as the law would not execute an innocent unborn child.
She was slated for execution on February 1st, 1693, alongside several confessors and convicted individuals. But Governor Phipps stepped in at the last minute on January 31st and issued a reprieve. Prior to her delayed execution date, she gave birth to a son named John in prison on January 27th, 1693.
She survived the gallows, but she entered a world where her life had been completely dismantled. Her conviction remained on the colony's books, rendering her dead in the eyes of the law through a concept known as attainder, which stripped her of her civil and property rights.
Because she had been declared a witch, she was no longer considered a citizen. She lost her home, her money, and was not legally allowed to own anything. Sheriff George Corwin had seized the family's goods, including their food and cattle, leaving her surviving children with absolutely nothing.
Elizabeth Procter refused to simply accept this injustice. She decided to fight back and eventually found success.
After the trials, she found herself in a bitter dispute with John Procter's children over her right to an inheritance and her dower rights. On May 27, 1696, Elizabeth petitioned the General Court to recover what she was rightfully owed for her supply and support, utilizing a written prenuptial agreement she had made with John as her legal leverage.
She married a man named Daniel Richards in 1699. Her fierce determination paid off. In July 1703, Elizabeth Procter's attainder was officially reversed by an act of the General Court, a rare victory that she shared with only two other women at the time, Abigail Faulkner and Sarah Wardwell. It took until 1711 for the whole family's attainder to be officially reversed, and restitution was finally paid in 1712.
Let's remember the real women. While The Crucible is a brilliant allegory for McCarthyism and the Red Scare, it is a highly dramatized and largely fictionalized accounts of people from the Salem witch trials. The drama is heightened with the deliberate liberties that the author took with the Proctor's family.
For example, Miller famously changed John Procter from a 60-year-old man into a 35-year-old. Furthermore, in the play, Mary Warren gives Elizabeth a poppet that she made in court, which directly leads to Elizabeth's arrest for witchcraft, a detail that was entirely invented for the stage.
Arthur Miller does depict this marriage stained by infidelity with Abigail Williams. That is totally fabricated. He was a 60-year-old man. Abigail Williams was a child.
She was 11 years old. It didn't happen. And we know that the real Elizabeth Procter was a strong woman who endured a harrowing examination, the execution of her husband, months in the Salem jail, the complete loss of her legal rights, only to bravely fight the colonial court system and reclaim her life.